All right, hey everybody, welcome to module number 4. We are rolling. Just want to come on and give you a preview, a brief little overview of what it is that we're going to be learning for this next module. So you just learned about the transatlantic slave trade. And so now we're going to take that next step of what happens when the Africans come over to North America during the colonial period. Okay. And so in order to explore that, we got some really cool things that we're going to learn. And so again, we're going to talk about this idea of African people in the colonial period of what we call British America. This is before we come fully as Americans yet. We're still, they come as fully as Americans yet. People are still considered to be in the colonial period at this time. Okay. And so, in order for us to anchor ourselves within the text, we're going to be reading chapter 3. And as always, I like to give you guys not just what the textbook has to say, but also give you some really cool things that I think is important for you to be able to walk away with. Now, this idea of colonization, it is a deal. In fact, there is a real pushback against settler colonialism. And this is essentially some of the critique that many African studies scholars have started to argue in regards to the colonial period. This is a really cool overview of this kind of just historical time that was written by a scholar named Dr. Akinyele Umoja. He is a brilliant scholar that based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and he gives this really amazing breakdown about how African identity has transformed since the colonial period. Essentially, African people never lost their sense of self. They've always considered themselves to be a people or a nation within a nation. And so I want to give you this really good overview about this time period. What did it look like for African people to kind of engage with this colonial period? What did it look like for them to push back against settler colonialism? Okay. And what does it mean for the Republic or the White Republic to be American Republic to be built off of this particular premise? And you see this premise really kind of be a narrative of much of the colonial projects that we still see to this day. So, for those of you who are interested in engaging in this particular topic of settler colonialism, might be something that's very familiar to you. I really want to encourage you to get into this article. Now, what's very interesting is I always want to say to folks, everybody didn't come over here on the slave ship. Every African person was not brought over here on the slave ship. There were absolutely African people that were already here, or melanated people, or dark skinned people already here in the continent of North America. But those who did come during the colonial project or the colonial period, they come in a variety of ways. They didn't just come as servants. Some came as interpreters, some came as soldiers, some came, no doubt, as servants. But this was a very curious thing about how African people came into the colonial period. So I want to give you that moment. And I want to also show you a very distinct thing that happens during the colonial period. African people that are servants are sometimes given very racialized sentences when they violate conditions of their servitude. What am I meaning? If you ran away from the plantation and you were caught, you might have ran away with some of your white friends who also were indentured servants. But the consequences of running away were very racialized. While your white friend might have only got an extension of time on his indentured servitude time, you, as a Black person, might have gotten a lifetime sentence of servitude, which is a very indicative thing that we see in the construction of America, which is a what we call systemic racism or racism by consequence. This is a very important point to kind of make within our class because as you see, there are so many different types of African people showing up in the colonial period. Slaves, servants, interpreters, soldiers, workers, merchants, even. But then there becomes a very intentional justification based off of race, of penalizing African people and assuming that because of their race, their real role during the construction of America is the role of servitude and servitude only. In fact, it's this type of logic that gives rise to the emergence of slave codes. In order to kind of compensate for the variations of African identities or African roles within the colonial period. The early colonists and the early constructors of America's society started to create rules and regulations to help navigate these diversities and this difference between African people. For instance, one of the slave codes that we see is that African people could not own other African people. And you kind of get a sense of that when you read Africans in the Colonial America tab that I just came from. One of the guys that ran away was actually running away from a plantation that was owned by a black man. Okay. And so slave codes are a very curious thing about how we see the beginning of systemic racism start to manage and manipulate and police black bodies. Okay. For those of you who might be very interested in this idea of slave codes, I want to give you a link to the Library of Congress so that you could see some really interesting real life court cases in which these slave codes might have been perpetuated, have been used to justify, to try people, to convict people of certain things. And so this is a really cool website that takes you straight to the Library of Congress. And some of you might want to go down this rabbit hole and look a little more in depth about these things. I also want to give you just a quick synopsis of some of the popular slave codes that we might be curious to see what they were. Okay, one of the slave codes, again, slaves cannot own weapons, they cannot gather in groups larger than four. I mean, just really, really, really interesting things about how they controlled black bodies. In addition to this colonial project of slavery and slave codes, you also have this moment of just slavery being an industry. I can't emphasize this enough that slavery absolutely was a business. And there are many people that benefit from slavery, both in the South and in the North. Because of the industry, you have so many different levels of the industry. As you've seen with the transatlantic slave trade and the Ma'afa, people who offered insurance to slave ships and slave voyages are going to be benefactors of the institution of slavery. In the same way that people who own stores or auctions where people can go and purchase slaves, they are also going to be benefactors from the institution of slavery. They may not have owned slaves themselves, but they are definitely integral in the industry of slavery. And so I give you just kind of a big, broad overview of some of the nuanced things about the industry of slavery. Okay. And as always, you get a chapter summary or a module summary, some big things that I want you to take away. And then here is your chapter that we will be reading for this week. You are going to be anchored in chapter 3. As always, I make sure that you all have access to this chapter. Please take a look at it. Please take a look at not just the chapter of the contents of the chapter, but I also want to give you an opportunity to review this chapter with the reading review questions. Okay, so I would advise that you take a look at the chapter review questions and then go back into the book and then be able to anchor yourself and what you're pulling out of your reading. Okay, so make sure that you're answering your chapter review questions soundly and as well as possible. I can always tell if you guys are not reading and you're just kind of giving me your opinion. So let's not do that. Let's make sure we're anchoring ourselves in the textbook. And then finally, for this particular discussion, for this particular week, you always have your discussion post. Okay, and as we talk about slave codes, I want you to think about contemporary laws, contemporary moments that you might be able to make a correlation between slave codes and modern day forms of laws that target, unfortunately, Black and Brown people. One of them that comes to mind is the stop and frisk law. Okay. And so I want you to reflect on that, think about it in a very cool way, and be able to really get a sense about how impactful these slave codes were. And the reason why I have you doing this is because now we're getting ready to get into our first essay. Okay, essay number 1. Your essay is going to be about slave codes. Now, for each one of our assignments, you always have the opportunity to choose a topic. You can use a very general topic, or you can go into a topic that's very specific. For this particular module, you could talk about just slave codes in general, justify why they are a topic worth talking about. Give me in your writing how you assess how these slave codes changed the course of history. For those of you who want a more specific or more specified topic, I want you to consider these 2 codes. Slaves could not assemble in large groups without a white person present, and slaves were prohibited from the use of drums and other loud instruments. Can you make any connections to these particular codes? And why do you think these codes were created? Okay, take a second, Think about this, put it through your brain computer, and write me a really good essay. Make sure when you're writing your essay that you are using 2 pages, double space, 12-point font, and 1-inch margins. For those of you who need a number count, remember we're going to use about 500 to 1,000 words, and you need to include a works cited page at the end of your essay. You are welcome to use some of the material within our course, or you're welcome to use materials outside of our course, but make sure you make a works cited page at the end of your essay. And for those of you who really need some help, how do I get started on this essay? I have no idea. I want to bring your attention back to our course syllabus. If you look in our course syllabus, I have this tab here, Timeline, Essay Basics, and more. Essay Basics tab will give you kind of like a roadmap, if you will. It's a scaffolding moment that allows you to now see what each paragraph should be talking about. Okay. So I want to encourage you, if you need to get some sense of how am I going to even talk about this, start here so that you can get a sense of what I'm expecting for you to write and how we're going to write for the rest of our essays moving forward. Okay. So again, I hope this video was helpful. If not, please let me know. I look forward to reading you all's work. The slave code topic is a very, very fun topic to be able to write about as we first are introducing ourselves to just get acclimated to writing. And if you need anything or you have any concerns, please do not hesitate to let me know. Okay, everybody, I hope this was helpful. Take good care. Love you. Bye.